I'm not going to talk to this, but there's an argument that was going on through the 19th century, through the 1800s, between a fairly well-known fellow, a great pessimist, Thomas Malthus, who reckoned that when populations increased, then wages fell. Now, we've already gone a bit through this, so I won't belabor the point because I want to get on to other things. But Malthus, at the beginning of the 1800s, said population causes wages to fall. Okay. We've already seen in the previous slide the reason why that works, because population doesn't cause wages to fall. What it does, it causes land values and land rents to increase. And the increasing land rents often kind of rebound to cause wages to fall. So yes, indirectly, that's true, but it's because of this middle process, the effect of land that Malthus didn't talk about. Malthus had his, shall we say, political associations, which caused him to be probably less open to what was really going on. But he remains as a very influential thinker of the early 19th century. The late 19th century, we had a chap, Mathus was an Englishman. This chap, Henry George, who was an American, actually from the west coast of the United States, he actually came up with a different view. He said that population growth gave landlords greater power. And that was a problem because he still noticed that you had poverty happening over time, which Malthus sort of was concerned about poverty, at least he said he was. But George says, well, the odd thing about it is that poverty actually comes when everything else should be going positively. Steam engines, for instance, impoverished Englishmen. What we're talking about with AI, it's a big question mark. Will the progress into the AI world, whether or not things actually do what they're supposed to or not, beside the point, will it cause this stuff? Henry George says that is really weird because, in fact, there's greater wealth in the community as a result of progress. Hands down, we're a lot better off. So poverty actually doesn't have to happen. Something is causing this gap to arrive where progress causes poverty. Whereas, in fact, progress should be making life better for everybody. That's a historical fact. And when again, going back to, the both sides of politics talking about, increasing productivity and all that sort of carry on. Oh dear, oh dear. It's an example of the carrot in front of the donkey sort of thing, where we're promised a nice thing just out of reach for us, and the more we move towards it, actually, the more it moves away from us. Henry George took David Ricardo's ideas and said that the poverty that comes from progress is political in nature, not natural. And so understanding that and, where we are with relation to it is, I think, quite useful, especially as you move through your professional careers, because you can ask yourself, if we've got progress, wouldn't it be nice if it actually lifted everybody rather than actually drove a lot of people into poverty? It actually polarized incomes. Okay. So there's political nature. It's actually got an economic nature. And that's one of the reasons why economics, the other side of the year 1900, was called political economy, because political economy recognized that when you study our economic relationships, buying and selling stuff from each other, it had a lot to do with politics as well as the buying and selling, what we look at now as economics. So political economy is the world that Malthus and Henry George were occupying. That got separated, but again, that's a story for another day. I won't talk about that too much at the moment. But you've got this great opportunity. Populations is the cause, I'll say source, but the cause of demand. In other words, if you've got 1 million people and you're running I don't know, a bread bakery, you've got 1 million people wanting bread. And so there's going to be a lot more than if you've only got 1,000 people and you're running a bakery. You're not going to be able to bake as many loaves, so you won't do so well. So population is a source of demand. Also, people are the people who sometimes are inventors, entrepreneurs, explorers, whatever. And so innovation is what drives our technological development anyway. You've got to have people in order to have innovation. And so Henry George was an optimist. Mathus was the pessimist. Henry George was the optimist. You chaps have to be comfortable, make decisions, conclusions, what have you, as to who was closer to reality, which ultimately is what education is all about. Okay, let's carry on. George was optimistic to the extent that he saw high population as equaling high productivity. He realized there were high rents. He said, well, that was funny, okay? And you can go into George. Now, at this stage, some of you who are a little bit politically astute would say, hang on, doesn't that mean that George was against free enterprise and capitalism and all those sort of things? So he's talking about high rents and, good things turning into bad things, and maybe steam engines are a bad idea and all this. But the curious thing about George was that he actually wasn't on either side. In fact, he was far more of a promoter for private enterprise. Yeah, that's a complicated story. I'll probably have to give a separate class on that. The thing about it is that on one hand, he's saying that these high rents are actually bad for the community. But if you go back to that previous slide where we had all the land graph thing, the high rents are the enemies of the entrepreneurs. Okay, remember the yellow area is spread between or split between return to wages and the return to profits. In other words, entrepreneurial incomes. The landlord he's not an entrepreneur, he just sits back and collects the rent. The entrepreneur is a person who decides to run a barber shop rather than simply be employed as a barber. Henry Ford was a chap who wanted to make motor cars rather than, I don't know, work in a factory or something. He was an entrepreneur. But his enemy was land rents just as much as everybody else's. So George kind of occupies a strange space where he says entrepreneurial profits are actually compromised by land rents just as much as wages are. And so he's kind of a friend of the entrepreneurs, the businessmen, and people who work for a living. So he sort of had a curious place in history. Okay, I'm not going to read the. Oh, maybe I will. I shall conclude this very long chapter. This is the end of his chapter on land and land rents in The Wealth of Nations. Very, very important, written in the 1700s. And Adam Smith, as you know, was the father of, modern economics or modern classical economics. Every improvement in the circumstances of society tends either directly or indirectly to raise the real rent of land. Fax machines, steam engines, AI, mobile phones, every improvement in the circumstances of society, either directly or indirectly, tends to raise the rent of land, to increase the real wealth of the landlord, his power of purchasing the labour, and the produce of the labour of other people. Now, Adam Smith was definitely no socialist, but he's saying that the landlord is getting all this benefit, the power of purchasing labour and the produce of labour of other people. Okay, that's a really insightful statement. It's probably one of the best things that you'll find in The Wealth of Nations. There's a lot of interesting things in The Wealth of Nations, but I would say that is probably the most insightful single part. I would recommend that you, I won't say memorize it. It certainly won't be in the exam as something you have to sort of just say off the top of your head. But being familiar with it, I think is very powerful in how you direct your understanding of the way Australia works as we move forward in time.